everyone, welcome back to our channel. My name is Ray and I'm here with Eileen Dacey, a social worker and PhD candidate specializing in hoarding intervention, support, and research. We're super excited to have her here with us today. Eileen, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yes. Hi, Ray. Thanks for having me, and hello, everyone. So as Ray mentioned, my name is Eileen Dacey, and presently I'm passionate about hoarding disorder and doing this work in a clinical sense for many years now. So my role, what that might look like, is I am an outpatient therapist in a group private practice called the New England Center for OCD and Anxiety. I am located in the greater Boston area, Massachusetts. I am also an adjunct professor at Simmons University, national consultant in all things related to hoarding disorder, and current PhD candidate also at Simmons University. And my PhD is in social work and policy.
Thank you. You bring such great experience. Yeah, we're really excited to have you. I'm curious, how did you kind of get into kind of the field of hoarding? Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a question that I get asked often, actually. And it's a complicated question. I think that my journey has had two different lanes kind of pointing in this direction around hoarding. First, perhaps I can start in a professional sense. When I graduated with my bachelor's, so post undergrad, I immediately got a job as a case manager, and I was working at an elder service agency here in Massachusetts. And my caseload, a great number of my caseload, entailed working with folks, going to their homes, setting them up with services. And during my home visits, I kept frequenting a lot of cluttered environments, even hoarded environments. And the services that were coming in, the responses that the clients were having were not positive. So having, let's say, heavy chore come in and do a cleanup within the home without the residents really consent or awareness around that. So, without knowing much about hoarding disorder at the time, I knew that something was going on a mental health sort of level. I kept asking my supervisor for direction, and the responses that I received were not great. They're like, "Oh, they can just throw the things away," and even I knew that that was not suitable. And it actually prompted me to go to grad school. So I immediately applied and got in at Simmons, where I did my master's of social work. And my first year placement, I specifically looked for a hoarding center where I could do my placement. And sort of the rest is history from there. I volunteered, I did my placement my first year there. And then as soon as I graduated, I was given the job offer, becoming the program director, clinical director of that program, where I stayed for a number of years. On a personal level, I have encountered hoarding situations throughout my life. And one that stands out most poignantly to me was when I was in middle school and having my best friend would go to her house rather frequently. And on one hand, being excited to go there because her mother owned a lot of animals. And as a child, I was like, oh, I love animals. This is amazing. I wasn't allowed to even have a pet. But then my understanding of my love for animals seemed to have differed from her love of animals, just purely based off of the treatment of those animals. So I really grappled with understanding that at such a young age. But it's also fueled my passion for understanding a different subtype of hoarding disorder known as animal hoarding. And I'd be happy to talk with you about that as well.
Yeah, we would love to hear. Yeah, kind of earlier you shared with me, kind of thinking about this idea of possession hoarding versus animal hoarding. And I hadn't heard it framed that way before. And so I'm curious, would you kind of explain to us what's the difference between these two things?
Sure, sure. Now, animal hoarding as a subtype of hoarding disorder is often overlooked, not just from a layman's perspective, but also from a therapeutic perspective. So, when we look at the DSM-5 TR, or the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, or I kind of joke and say the Bible for a therapist, or looking at all the different diagnoses, we see hoarding disorder. And underneath that, a little bit a ways down, we can see a very small paragraph describing animal hoarding, but not a lot of information on diagnostically what that looks like, right? So I know that on this series, possession hoarding is covered a great deal. We know with hoarding disorder, we see individuals struggle with parting with possessions regardless of their actual value due to this perceived need or urge to continue to hold on to that reason, or an indecisiveness as to what to do with the item. Coupled with a large volume of items that can now congest active living areas of the home. And then lastly, the clinically significant distress or impairment in functioning for the person, whether it's social, occupational, etc. Now with animal hoarding, it's not as much about possessions, but we're focused on animals. A misconception that people have is that they automatically assume that if a person has a great number of animals, they must struggle with animal hoarding. And that's actually false. So, on a statutory sense, depending on where you live, what municipality, what state, etc., we have statutes in place that govern how many animals each household can actually own. If you exceed that number, then you need to proceed with a kennel license. If you exceed that number, then you could fall subjected to potential trouble with law enforcement, if you will, humane law enforcement. But a person could have, let's say, 20 cats and take great care of those cats. It doesn't mean they struggle with animal hoarding behavior. It's much more focused on the quality of care for the animals. So ensuring that basic needs are being met. So veterinary care, food, shelter, water, etc. But coupled with, now here's a similarity between possession hoarding and animal hoarding, is that a person may have that almost compulsive like need to continue to acquire animals despite any evident problems that currently exist within the household. So any environmental concerns that the number of animals has produced on the house, on the person or persons that live there, any evident problems with the animals that the person already owns as well, and that excessive acquisition component of continuing to acquire more animals, whether that's adopting, going to a store, or even collecting ferals or strays, if you will. And having lower levels of insight around any of the problematic behavior that's currently within the household, if that makes sense. Another similarity and difference if we think about the two. Now, with possession hoarding, if we see a severe situation or a crisis situation, we think about what consequences might show up for the individual. Well, that could potentially mean eviction from their housing. It could potentially mean condemnation, so Board of Health may get involved. We may even see protective services get involved. These things can also be true in animal hoarding situations, but what makes it a little bit more complicated, or a lot more complicated, if I can be a little bit more direct here, is that with animal hoarding actually falls under federal guidelines of thinking about animal cruelty, depending on the severity of the situation. So now the person, yes, we can see subjected to condemnation, eviction, adult protective services, child protective services, etc. But humane law enforcement may actually get involved, potentially legally seize the animals from the home, and there could be the potential of pressing charges, prosecution, even incarceration time for the individual, again, depending on the case and the severity of that case. So certainly much more complicated, with many more detrimental outcomes potentially for a person with animal hoarding versus possession hoarding.
That's a really helpful kind of like differentiation to hear, and interesting to hear about like some of the overlaps maybe with possession hoarding. Um, and I'm curious, right? Like you kind of named that there's a really kind of like small specifier in the DSM about animal hoarding, and it sounds like there's not a whole lot of like information kind of on animal hoarding. Like there already isn't a ton on possession hoarding. And so I'm hearing that maybe animal hoarding is we're still kind of filling that gap. And so I'm curious, what is your research or kind of your interest kind of look like kind of to help fill this gap?
Certainly, that's a really great point, Ray. Now, even though possession hoarding, we are still emerging and evolving and learning much more, both as academics as well as therapists. But at least we have a great or a better understanding of hoarding disorder. So, for instance, there's a validated treatment modality. There's now testing of other therapeutic modalities, such as compassion focused therapy, as being helpful for hoarding disorder, but specifically for possession hoarding, right? And for folks that are not in active crisis. So they have that luxury of time to be able to show up to their outpatient sessions on, let's say, a weekly basis. However, with animal hoarding, there is much less information that's out there. If you look at the published literature on animal hoarding, we see a lot of systematic reviews, a lot of characterization of what animal hoarding constitutes and consists of. But there are no tested and validated treatment modalities for intervening with animal hoarding cases. There's only speculation, potentially, let's say, through harm reduction, if you will. So if a therapist is actually embarking on an animal hoarding case, they don't really have necessarily those tools in a therapeutic sense to be able to intervene. Now, in addition to that, we can think about other professionals that are also now embarking on these cases, taking these cases on. Let's say, for instance, humane law enforcement officers, or also known as animal control officers or ACOs, is that they also don't have those specific guidelines either. And so people are really struck by the complexity of these cases as to what to do. And so I sort of say this in a way to a lot of people. It seems like people are winging it when it comes across these cases. So as a PhD candidate and now in my dissertation phase, my interest first in starting with this is having a better understanding of how ACOs actually navigate these cases. What do those case outcomes look like? What do they know at baseline about animal hoarding? Do they understand it as a mental health condition? And if so, are they interacting or consulting with social services within their area? So I'm a qualitative researcher, and right now I am interested in actually doing interviews on understanding those perspectives from ACOs, because I see this as a primer or pilot for my future academic work of what I'd like to do, developing actual intervention methods of moving forward with these particular cases so that we can help people in a greater sense and not just be so hyper focused on the
This seems
animals,
like
which has been notoriously the case, but what about the person as well?
just such huge and such important work for both, right, people experiencing hoarding,
Thank
specifically
you.
animal hoarding, but also folks, right, like in a supportive or intervening role. It kind of reminds me of kind of in the beginning, you were saying kind of in your first kind of case management experience and kind of looking at the way that the work was approached. And it sounded like a really compassionate approach of like, hey, the way that we're intervening and supporting like can be harmful. And so, yeah, I'm just really struck, I think, at that, yeah, like kind of compassionate approach kind of towards, yeah, towards working in this field. I think it's really big. Uh,
Mhm.
so I'm curious, if, folks are listening to this and they are like a helping professional or a professional, whether they're kind of more on the end of like law enforcement or on the end of kind of, yeah, like supportive counseling or helping professionals, like what would you want them to know?
Hmm. I think that there are several things for folks to know, and what stands out to me right now is first trying to be compassionate. I love that you use that term. Right? Is approaching cases and approaching individuals through an empathetic lens, right? And building building that rapport and relationship first and foremost. So not going into a case with assuming that someone is trying to cause harm to, let's say, animals, or not having a lot of insight around their problem, but really asking them a little bit more about their journey, their story. When did they see this as being an issue for themselves? What does it mean to them, right? And the next thing I would encourage professionals, whether you are in social services, therapists, or in law enforcement, is an emphasis around collaboration. So usually by the time a professional does get involved in an animal hoarding case, is that the case may feel very overwhelming, especially for just one person to own and hold on to. This is where we learn a lot from possession hoarding crisis cases, is that a team approach, a collaborative client-centered team approach, is of utmost importance to yield positive outcomes rather than one person making decisions on behalf of a resident. So the same applies with animal hoarding cases, is the professionals should communicate with each other. There should be a generation of a team. So if law enforcement gets involved, being able to connect with social services and vice versa. Have meetings that include the resident and develop goals and think about what is immediate and imminent, what could be some goals that we could kind of draw, push back a little bit further as well, and being able to work on that. So I would say empathy and team collaboration as being those two big pieces that I hope that folks can take away from this interview.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess kind of similarly, right, if like folks are kind of listening to this and resonating of like, from more like a personal lived experience lens, I'm curious what would you want them to know?
I, I think about this a lot as well. I think about that type of a question, where whether it's been worded that same way or somewhat similarly, is that we as a society seem to have more compassion and understanding around certain mental health issues. We privilege them over others. And unfortunately, hoarding disorder falls still under that sort of stigmatizing pool, and not a lot of wealth of understanding comes about from people, whether lay people or even therapists. Um, and so I can only hope that folks with lived experience can think about how it might be or what it would look like to actually reach out for some support, to actually say that, you know what, I would like to speak with someone. And that seems like you're putting a lot on the line. So my encouragement would be to actually have a candid conversation with a potential therapist if you're not actively involved with one, and kind of suss it out. See if this is someone who may demonstrate empathy and understanding and not judge you, versus someone where you're not going to feel entirely safe. If it doesn't feel safe, therapy is not going to be as productive. We know that from a therapist standpoint. So it might take a couple of tries until you find that right fit. But I do believe that right fit could be out there. And it all starts with actually just having that conversation of just saying, you know what, I could
Definitely.
use someone to speak to, and I would like to have some support around this issue.
Yeah, that's so important. And that kind of makes me think about kind of like resources. You shared with me that you wrote a book, and I'm curious if you maybe want to share about like any personal resources you would want to connect folks with, whether that's your book or kind of other things.
Yes, absolutely. So, the resources that are available out there on a national basis, it's going to take some digging on behalf of the person, because it looks different depending on where you live and that access. So if you think you're struggling with hoarding behavior, whether that's possession or animal or even the combination of the two, which can be the case for many people, is seeing if you can locate a therapist. Ideally someone who has expertise or specialty in the treatment of hoarding disorder. That would be really beneficial first and foremost. If not, being able to locate a therapist who has a good understanding of obsessive compulsive disorder and related disorders, because hoarding disorder does fall underneath that particular spectrum as its own distinct diagnosis. So at least having someone who has that expertise. If you are only able to locate some form of a professional support, such as professional organizer or hoarding remediation specialist, ensuring that they've been trained and they have worked on hoarding cases before, and asking them what has their experience been like. So if you hear something like, oh, I just go in and I make sure I clean everything out, that's going to be a red flag. So, just as you would take the time to interview anyone else pertaining to other areas of importance in your life, this is also worth investing in. So, that would be something that I would encourage when looking for resources. And Ray, as you mentioned, so I authored a book called Reclaim Your Life from Hoarding. It is a self help book pertaining to hoarding, that is filled with a lot of exercises. And in writing this book, I really wanted to make sure that I touched on animal hoarding, but I wanted to be sensitive around the language too. So I sort of renamed it and thought about it through multiple animal ownership. So depending if you're whatever realm you're looking for, this book has a little bit of each. And there's also a chapter in there for family members and loved ones of those who struggle with hoarding behavior on one end or the other, around how they might be able to approach this in a delicate and in empathic way as well.
I love that kind of, yeah, like interview kind of prompts that you invited there. And we'll be sure to link kind of your book in the description so folks can find it. Maybe to kind of close us out, I know that you work at kind of like all three levels of intervention, kind of the micro, meso, and macro level. I think we have so much to learn from you kind of being involved in all of those spaces. And so I'm curious, like, what is it like to work kind of at all those levels of intervention, or what can we learn from kind of your involvement there?
Sure, sure. I think it speaks to just even my training as a social worker, is that I view people as part of a larger environment. So it makes better sense for me clinically of not just working with someone on an outpatient basis, that sort of micro level, but thinking about how larger systems also influence people's day-to-day lives, which is why I do legislative and policy work pertaining to hoarding here in New England. For instance, I was involved in the creation of the hoarding disorder legislative proclamation here in Massachusetts, making it the second state in our union to have such legislative language, but also doing some other policy work, such as passing various bills pertaining to animal hoarding and possession hoarding here in Massachusetts, as well as some of my neighboring states, such as New Hampshire. What always strikes me as a complication in doing this work, depending on the types of levels, is, for instance, how we're not communicating with each other, or even how policymakers and researchers aren't communicating. So there can be folks that are really pushing for a particular bill to pass, or really thinking about policy analysis a little bit further, developing budgets without thinking about what the literature, the researchers are telling us about what would be effective, what would be detrimental. And so that can be rather frustrating on my end, and at times even overwhelming. The other thing that really becomes complicated either level is funding. Funding is always a very large question that people ask. Who's going to pay for this treatment? What if there's a crisis situation? Who's going to pay for that? And I think that as a nation, not just here in New England, we're still learning a lot more around sustainable financial efforts when helping people with hoarding disorder. for viewers who think that they may struggle with hoarding behavior, I always encourage taking a look at your insurance and seeing if you could connect with a provider who accepts your insurance or could advocate for a single case agreement if you're finding an out of network provider. Because I want to be sensitive to that. Treatment can be costly, but the benefit of that is that you're investing in you and you deserve that.
Eileen, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom. It's really exciting to hear about, yeah, the research and the efforts that are kind of being done in this space, and to hear about kind of your passion and your compassion for this work. Is there anything else that we haven't gotten to today that you wanted to share?
Oh, I don't think so. I mean, of course, there's so much more to know, so much more to discuss about hoarding in general. But if more comes up or people have questions, I'd love to come back and talk even more and get into more specifics. But it was a pleasure to be a part of this today. So thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that idea. So if folks have questions for Eileen that we didn't ask, please feel free to kind of drop them in the comments below. And yeah, maybe we can kind of circle back and get those questions answered. So until next time, everyone, thank you for listening. Thank you, Eileen. Bye.
Thank you.